Hi, welcome back. I am Dr. Derick Lindquist, and I am the Dean of the Jindal School of Psychology and Counseling, and I'm happy to welcome you back to our next episode of Minding the Mind. Today we're talking emotions, right? This is a topic everybody out there knows, is familiar with, right? Everybody has experienced their own emotions, but from a psychological perspective, right? How do we define an emotion? Well, emotion is something that has two components. There's a mental state and a physiological response. Now, on the mental side, what we mean is that there's an experience associated with every emotion. There's a feeling, a subjective feeling that accompanies every emotion that we have. So in this case, if we look at the pictures, right, all three of these indicate people that are clearly sort of in the realm, right? They're clearly experiencing this very strong emotional state. Now, when we think about emotions, we can think about each of those independent emotions of having sort of a discrete state. That is, they all exist independent of one another. So we can categorize them based on whether you're sad or frustrated or surprised, shy, mean, proud, disappointed, right? In this case, again, they all exist independently. They all have their own unique features. Alternatively, we can think about emotions as lying along a continuum. And in fact, in this case, they lie along two axes. One axis is what we call valence. How good or bad is it, right? We call this positive or negative valence. Secondly, we have arousal, high or low arousal. Right? We all know that some emotions, such as anger or fear, right? You can feel it in your body. You can feel that arousal that accompanies the emotion. That's what we're talking about here. So when we look at high arousal, negative valence, person may be tense or angry. High arousal, positive valence, they may be excited or delighted. Low arousal, right? You're just kind of chill, but on the negative side, you're depressed or maybe bored. Low arousal, positive, you're sleepy, calm, relaxed. Okay? Now, beyond the experience or the feeling, we also have the expression of an emotion. The expression is the overt thing that most of us can see. You can recognize emotions in other people, not because we have insight into their subjective state or the feeling, but because we can see it. We can see it in their body language and their gestures that they use, right? We know that people, when they communicate with others, we like to move around, right? I'm doing it right now. I walk around, I use my body, I use my hands, I use gestures. All of this can be used to convey information. And in this particular instance, it can also be used to convey information about the emotional state of the individual. Also, just as important, if not more so, the facial expression that accompanies different emotions. Right? So there was a famous psychologist back in the 1970s, a guy by the name of Paul Ekman, who has argued that humans have about 6 basic emotions. And these emotions are universally expressed around the world. Now, why did he make this argument? Because he took pictures, everyday people showing different emotions. Okay? Anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, and surprise. He took pictures of Americans and South Americans and Europeans and Asians and Africans. And then he traveled the world. He showed these pictures to different groups of people, and almost without exception, everybody was able to look at a picture and say, yeah, that person is angry, or yeah, that person is sad or disgusted. So based on this, Ekman argued again that these are sort of universal basic emotions that everyone on the planet experiences and expresses through their facial expressions in roughly the same way. The other component here is the arousal. Now, arousal is largely mediated through what's called the fight or flight response. I've mentioned this in passing before. Many of you are probably familiar with it. So here's our example. You're walking down a dark alley at night. You hear a strange noise, or maybe you see a stranger in front of you. And then suddenly, almost instantly, your heart is thumping. Your respiration, your breathing has quickened. You're sweating. Your pupils are dilating. Right? That's due to the activation of this fight or flight response. And as its name implies, it's preparing your body to either run away, flight, or preparing yourself to fight it out, right? To survive another day. Now, the brain regions responsible for emotional experiences and the expression of emotion are quite divergent. There's quite a few of them that play a role. Collectively, we refer to this as the limbic system. Today, I'm just going to talk to you about one structure in particular called the amygdala. The amygdala sits at the base of your brain in the temporal lobe, and the amygdala is really there to detect potential dangerous or threatening stimuli in our environment. Okay? So imagine I am walking down a path. Okay? I see a snake or a bear or some guy jumps out with a knife, right? Whatever the case may be, that sensory information is going to flow into my amygdala. It detects that potential danger or threat, and it turns on or activates my fight or flight response. Now again, I'm ready to run away or to fight it out as needed. So the amygdala triggers this fight or flight response. That's really one of its primary roles. We can see that the amygdala is highly attuned to environmental stimuli. Here's an example, right? So we put somebody in an fMRI scanner, which we talked about in our last episode. And we're going to show these subjects pictures of people with happy facial expressions or fearful facial expressions. And what we find is there's much more amygdala activation when we look at a fearful face than a happy face. Why? Because if you're looking at somebody and they look afraid, well, you probably should be looking around your environment and trying to figure out, why are they afraid, right? Is there something dangerous in my environment I need to be aware of? So again, the amygdala kind of focuses in on that, and it can detect that stuff very rapidly, and if need be, turn on that fight or flight response in preparation. Now, the amygdala doesn't actually turn on the fight or flight response directly. Rather, it activates another collection of brain regions. So in this case, it activates or turns on, quote, quote, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus activates the pituitary gland, which in turn activates the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidneys, and they in turn are going to release both adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Now, most of you know about adrenaline, right? If you get that adrenaline surge, right, that's your fight or flight, right? Your heart rate's going, your respiration's going, right? You're just all pumped up. That's adrenaline. Cortisol has similar effects. So the amygdala triggers this HPA axis, which in turn activates that fight or flight response. Now, one of the benefits of this is on our memory. Okay? If you think about your daily experiences, most of them are pretty mundane, right? They go into your short-term memory, and they may be there for hours or even days. But most of that stuff we're going to forget over time. But if you have an emotionally arousing experience, one that's sufficient to activate that fight or flight response, that leads to the release of adrenaline and cortisol, those two compounds, the adrenaline and the cortisol, working in tandem, can actually strengthen the durability of that memory. It can better encode it, better store it, so it's more durable and it's available to you, not just months later, but perhaps even years or decades, or in some cases even a lifetime later. Because if that experience is emotionally arousing, right? You've had a fight with your spouse, right? Or some other event that kind of got you all aroused, well, it must be important. Those are the things that you need to emphasize and remember at a later date. And for some of these, again, they can actually be so arousing or so traumatic that we may actually remember them decades or even a whole lifetime later. So these are referred to as flashbulb memories. Classic example, 9/11 in the US back in 2001. Right? I still remember it like it was yesterday. I can tell you everything I did on that day. A more local example may be the Mumbai attacks. But the idea is that you've had some experience that, again, is most likely traumatic to some degree, which then basically sort of makes that memory permanent. As one person put it, it's like the memory is tattooed on your brain. So that's the idea. Emotion, arousal, and the release of cortisol and adrenaline can lead to the permanence of these memories. Now, the bad side here is that if you have a prolonged elevation in cortisol, that can actually have deleterious effects on your body and your mental state. So high, prolonged, or chronic elevation of cortisol can lead to problems with your heart in terms of your blood pressure, your digestive system, your immune system. And it can have consequences on your mental processes as well. So here's the idea. High levels of emotional arousal can actually shut down or hijack the area of the brain in front. We call this the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for what we call executive functions. These are those higher order cognitive abilities that we think are largely unique to people. So your ability to control your emotions, your ability to put something into your mind or your working memory where you can kind of ponder it and think about it. That might be a long-term memory or what you're planning to do for your day. Your ability to self-monitor and regulate your own behavior, right? So you're not as impulsive as you may otherwise be. Your ability to set goals and plan for the future. If you have chronic activation of emotionally arousing events, right? In other words, if you have chronic activation of your HPA axis in your fight or flight response, that in turn can hijack your prefrontal cortex. You inhibit it. It's not working as well as it should, which means these executive functions are impaired as well, which can have really serious consequences on your day-to-day life. So it's important that we be able to manage our emotions. We don't want to maintain this elevated arousal or stress, if you will. So one of the ways we can do this is to teach people about emotional intelligence, right? Understanding and recognizing your own emotional states and those of other people. The ability to regulate those emotions. The ability to recognize those emotions in others, to empathize with them, and so forth. So again, this is a big goal in psychology, helping us and other people to be able to better control their own emotional states, which in turn has a big influence on our thinking, our behavior, and other features. So with that said, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you again the next episode.